There was a moment talking with Ann Watts as it became clear that, according to her, despite all of her efforts to secure an apology by the other facilitators, that they were unwilling to extend such an apology. And I said to her that there were at least 30 things that were off about that. And I felt a sense of the kind of impending tragedy that was a consequence of the facilitators deciding first to exclude me from the circle and meet behind closed doors with me as the one person not invited, then to deny that this was a high issue, and based on the denial that it was a high issue, to then deny an apology for what, in their words, was not a high issue. And I see things geometrically, very quickly and intuitively, and it takes a lot of work to flush that out. But I wanted to do that here because abuse patterns are not personal. Hai teaches to quit taking it personally, and I don't take it personally, but ironically that makes it that much more important that all involved in the community are aware of the different dimensions upon which abuse occurs. So it's a long list. I'll go through it very briefly because the underlying data is, laid out in well over 100 hours of kind of nuanced video that's available for anyone that wants to explore the additional information section. But let's look at some of the dimensions involved. The first and primary one, because all of this took place in a professional container, meaning there's never been an interaction with a facilitator in or out of workshop that is not held within a professional container, paying to be a participant, paying to be a therapeutic client with 4 separate facilitators, paying Peter Sandhill to be my psychedelic sitter for my first psychedelic experience. These are all professional containers. And so professional abuse, and I think that the most significant aspect of this abuse is that, first, to give a little context, that as we grow as individuals, we have the authentic self, the authentic personality that comes through in the child-parental relationship. And that personality in an abuse cult is abused. The child sees secrets within the family system that are taboo to talk about. So in my family, there were rules, and the number 1 rule was, thou shalt not make your parents feel things intensely. And this rule is a very deep rule. It ripples out into any number of follow-up rules, because one of the consequences is one cannot speak the truths that are there, which might elicit those deep feelings. And another truth might be that, and a secondary rule, much less significant, was the parents don't make mistakes. So if a parent does something wrong, it has to be figured out how to blame it on the child or something else. And when these rules are broken, trauma is induced through hitting, shouting, punishing, shaming, etc. And what results is the adaptive personality. The adaptive personality is the part that says, okay, I can't acknowledge deep feelings. That's against the law in this system. So how can I get my needs met without acknowledging feelings? Or parents can't make mistakes. So how am I going to frame this that I still get my needs met without being punished when the parent is in fact the one who has lied or broken an agreement or hit the child, etc., etc. And this is called the adaptive personality. And the parents are comfortable with the adaptive personality, but are afraid of the authentic personality because the authentic personality always breaks the family system rules, because the family system rules are unhealthy. And so for a healthy individual to come into its own, they have to break the family taboos. And in doing so, terrify the parents, because the purpose of taboos is to protect the parents from things they're not ready or willing to deal with in themselves or in the culture at large. So the number one abuse in terms of, particularly in the psychedelic session, but also with the facilitators at large, is that the adaptive personality was fostered, tolerated, pampered, encouraged, but that the authentic personality, the one that brings truth and awareness, was feared within the high facilitator body in the same way it was feared at home. And the consequence of that, because needs are still there, there are needs with a parent, that gets projected onto the therapist. And so the regressed therapeutic patient has the same needs as the child in that type of dynamic, because to do good therapy, you have to go back into the childhood dynamic. And so there's a number of consistent patterns where the adaptive personality becomes necessary because the authentic personality is directly feared, lied to, attacked, pushed down. And so this is, I think, one of the primary issues of abuse, because the whole purpose of therapy is to break apart the coping mechanisms that were necessary in a dysfunctional family and restore the right of the individual to come into their own and speak their truth. When the therapist, however, is terrified of the truths because they challenge some of the unhealthy dynamics in the power body, in this case, the high facilitators, then there is money exchanged, which deepens the negligence. I like to say my parents paid me to be abused by raising and paying for housing, but I paid the high facilitators to abuse me. And so that's a completely different order of magnitude and goes against the whole principle of therapy. The second dimension is peer support for the abuse pattern, rather than support for the healthy aspects of the therapeutic client. So, whether it's Peter hiring his lawyer and giving me vicarious advice, or Peter telling me that Sarah supports him and that I'm wrong, or Peter telling me that he's never going to trust me again, or the facilitators meeting with Peter. In other words, a therapeutic client informs the entire facilitator body that a decade-long pattern of sexual abuse and therapeutic negligence has occurred to the person they chose, trained, and unilaterally or unanimously recommended to a client, and then abuse has occurred. And in a healthy organization, the support goes to the therapeutic client, And this restores trust in the system. In an abuse enabling culture, the abusers come together in an act of solidarity and use the superior mass to actually defend the abuse pattern by protecting the abuser within, in this case, Peter Sandhill. And so this peer support and lack of responsibility is a very important dimension of the abuse. And it's unanimous, meaning Linda Sassara, who taught Peter Sandhill his abusive psychic abilities, took zero responsibility, while lending him credibility by co-teaching and leading a class, and him using her name is one of the reasons I had respect for Linda. And so the fact that he'd worked with Linda elevated my confidence in Peter Sandhill, and the fact that I saw them teaching together again elevated confidence. But she took zero responsibility for failing to teach a student competent psychic ethics, just as the Human Awareness Institute facilitators and board members in mass took zero responsibility. And in fact, Peter would tell me he'd consulted with an energy worker who had told him that I was wrong and that he was doing everything right. So there's not only a lack of support for the victim of therapeutic and professional negligence, there's a ganging up to support the abuser, and in doing so betraying not only the authentic self within the client, within Dane, but within Peter as well, because that same tension is going on within each individual. The coping mechanism used to survive, which is always diseased in response to a diseased environment, and the authentic self. The third is the dimension of violation. And in violation, you have an energy field, and you have a sense of what is in integrity with that field. And then you have acts and choices that violate that. And so Peter began the process of holding container for me by violating his marriage. In Peter's words, it was easier not to tell Sarah. It was less complicated not to tell Sarah what he was doing. So it begins with violating his marriage. It continues by violating his agreement with each of his fellow facilitators, continued with violating any number of best therapeutic boundaries and practices, continued by betraying the container that we'd agreed to by not showing up and not communicating and just being late and not communicating, by breaking the law. And, these are healing fields. No one who is fully integrated mentally and emotionally around best relationship practices needs an organization like HI. The purpose of learning healthy relationship skills is actually to heal faulty beliefs, faulty protocols, confusions about what love and abuse are. They often get mingled. And this puts it in a psychologically healing role, which is broken. That Hippocratic oath, first do no harm, is violated, when instead the influence of the therapist in a vertical relationship, a professional relationship, is actually used to reinforce or harm the client. The fourth dimension is that of statistics. And this is a very important one. And you can ask yourself, and it's hard actually to get some of this data because there's a lot of cover-up in our culture. the sexual relationships with a therapist are not uncommon. I don't know the exact number because therapists collude to mask that information. But of the relationships that become sexual with a therapist, 90% or more of those relationships harm the client. So in that one point alone, you're setting your client up for a 90% chance of failing, for a 90% chance of being hurt. You can't ethically take money while practicing. It'd be like me promising to fix your house with a 90% chance I would set it on fire instead and give you the bill. And so there are any number of statistics around these specific behaviors that are all heavily slanted towards the negative, meaning the specific abuses that I'm calling out all set the client up to fail and be harmed most of the time. And that is the opposite of what we want to see in a professional relationship that has a mission, of course, of helping the client. The fifth dimension is a lack of traumatic awareness. Now, traumatic abuse is rife within the culture, and traumatic ignorance is rife within the culture. And trauma has a biological component, it has an emotional component, and then it ripples out in a variety of different ways. But I can say with some amazement in retrospect that of the 30 lover relationships within the high community, of my many interactions with team members, in my work with 30 workshops and my work with 4 separate high facilitators, not one of them brought attention to the fact that, 1, I was demonstrating traumatic symptoms, and 2, that many of them were as well. And so there is zero awareness of, in language, of these traumatic dynamics, which, when that's the issue, like if you take your car to a car mechanic and they say everything's fine, but they're not checking the brakes and the brakes are not working, it's incredibly dangerous because you go away thinking, well, they're the mechanic, they must know things, and you go away and your brakes don't work and you get in an accident and you don't know why. And your therapist is right there to charge more money to listen to the accident, but not to take responsibility for the fact they didn't communicate or check the brakes as part of their protocol, which is incredibly negligent when there are such high traumatic levels. Numbers of team members and lovers demonstrated extreme traumatic symptoms, and none of them had the language to present it in a way where they could take care of themselves or avoid traumatizing me or avoid being traumatized by me. So that's another aspect of the abuse. Number 6, age regression and dynamics. When you have unresolved trauma, and you do have unresolved trauma until you thoroughly understand the pattern and deal with the traumatic incidents, in childhood, of which most people have not done so. One of the things that happens, particularly in therapy that addresses some of the issues, is age regression. And the thing about age regression is that it will happen. It is inevitable that it will happen. One of the reasons it happens is when certain parts of the presenting persona or presenting personality are not loved by anyone involved. There is always an age regression and deterioration in that period. And this is part of what happened in the psychedelic session, is certain things came up that I didn't know how to love or integrate. But unfortunately, Peter Sandhill didn't know either. And unfortunately, none of the facilitators did either. So age regression is inevitable in that situation. The problem is when age regression itself is not competently understood, anticipated, and cared for, you end up treating someone who may be regressed to 4 years old emotionally, 2 years old emotionally, as if they're their present physical age, but they're not. They're navigating reality as a 3-year-old in that period and in that arena of their life. And it is essential that the inner age be acknowledged and responded to at a level appropriate for that inner age. That inner age cannot be burdened with the responsibilities of fixing a defunct therapist, for example. And one of the trauma therapists that the high facilitators subsequently regressed, when I talked with her for 3 hours, she was 3 years old emotionally. And of course, I knew about it by then, not because High had taught me, because I'd read a book. And I asked her, how old do you feel emotionally? She was 3 years old, completely unable to cope. Because High had the facilitators, after re-triggering incest memories and things in the support group with violation there, proceeded to shame her by passing the message along that it was her fault, that they didn't do anything wrong. And this causes a binding up in that period, which is usually very self-destructive for the person who is regressed. And much of the period that I've been dealing with this whole issue, emotionally, I've been about 4 years old, sometimes 2, sometimes 6, rarely older than 6. And when that dynamic is not understood, a tremendous amount of shame and violation gets passed on to the client. 7, the abuse contract. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, the abuse contract is the coping mechanism and agreement signed by the little boy with the parent who needs to abuse them for whatever reason, usually hurt them and then cover it up and then turn it into love so that the abuser feels better, often demanding enablement and pleasing by the little one. And the little one signs an agreement to survive. Okay, Dad, I won't make you feel anything even though you're hurting me. Okay, I'll pretend I like this when I hate it. Because if I say I hate it and you don't know how to do a better job, you feel bad and you hurt me, so I'm going to say that I like what I hate. This is an abuse contract. And every traumatized child with an incompetent parent signs a survival abuse contract that gets them through. And invariably, in a shame-based culture, this abuse contract gets rewritten as love. No. We hit you because we love you. We didn't listen to your feelings because you had to grow up. And so the abuse contract gets relabeled as love. And no one wants to deal with this in our culture. And the result is you have a lot of people who are abiding by these abuse contracts because they're still regressed in that area. And they are afraid of dying, which is what a little child feels when they see the rage of their parent because they've violated the family system and taboo. So in the abuse contract, there's a couple of different metrics of how well it's dealt with. One is it conscious or unconscious? For most people, it's unconscious. What's your abuse contract? If you don't know, it's not likely that you never signed one. It's likely that it was taboo to talk about. Confused as love or clear as abuse. This is key. Because if the fine print of your abuse contract says you will relabel all of my abuse as love, or you will not belong to this family, well, a child needs survival, security, love, and belonging, the first primary human needs. If they cannot meet those needs by telling the truth, if the family will disown them for telling the truth, they will lie to secure love and belonging. So is it labeled as love, or is it clear in their mind that it's abuse? This determines the level of empowerment one has to step over the line, the taboo line, in the abuse contract. And finally, is it broken or intact? Because if someone has an intact abuse contract that is unconscious and relabeled as love, anyone who touches certain buttons in that personality will regress that individual, and they will be completely incapable of defending themselves. And this places the burden of responsibility on, in this case, the therapist, who holds the other side of the contract, whether they know it or not. You see, the therapist doesn't have to say in their own mind, I'm going to kill this person if they cross this line. The therapist simply has to be unconscious of the abuse contract that their client is projecting on them. And once projected, if the therapist's face shows displeasure, the inner child at 3 years old that signed that contract says, I can't tell the truth to my therapist. They will kill me. They will disown me, they won't like me, and I will die. Now, it is an abuse not to bring light to this central and core issue in all power dynamic relationships. This is why, by the way, it is unethical for a therapist to have a sexual relationship with a client. This is why it is so dangerous when a boss like Harvey Weinstein uses the unconscious abuse contracts with his staff and with his rising stars to say the same thing. You must have sex with me or you will die. They get it at 3 years old and they cannot fight it because they're regressed and because it's relabeled as love. He's doing them a favor, right? 8, chauvinism within high. There's a safe sex conversation that's taught, but the chauvinism that denies the femininity, that is the emotion, the felt experience, is expressed by not teaching a safe emotional conversation. Not a single one of my high lovers on team, Peter, anyone else, began the sexual relationship with a safe emotional conversation. This is a dishonor of the feminine, and it ensures that the feminine in one or both people has a high odds of being violated. Because a safe emotional conversation goes into these types of things, asks about patterns and dynamics, asks about how old one becomes when certain things get pushed, looks at how to help the other person through some of these patterns in a culture where 80% or more of people are dealing with this stuff and don't know it, because we insist in the chauvinism of our education and culture, we insist on putting teenagers through their most emotional years in life with shame, humiliation, embarrassment, and not a single formal hour of emotional literacy, of emotional coaching and intelligence, of relational literacy. It is an abuse cult. And this absence of honoring the feminine is a dimension. It's in the dimension of chauvinism and abuse. 9, shame. The superhuman shame dumping, where the abuser blames the victim. And this becomes shame when a parent can't make mistakes And so he shouts at a child because he spilt the honey, because the child ran in and said, "Hey," and dad spills the honey, and dad shouts at the child because dad can't make a mistake. Because in an abuse cult, to make a mistake means dad has to be punished. Someone has to be punished for all mistakes in a shame-based cult. It's not okay to make mistakes. And so when the more powerful person in the dynamic, the parent to the child, the therapist to the client, the big man with the money, with the person who doesn't have their life together, etc., when they say it's your fault, the child takes on the shame, which is the inadequacy of the parent in a dynamic where they don't have the authority to assert themselves. And so, we have the high facilitators excluding me. We have the push towards secrecy. We have the message of valuelessness and worthlessness, and the refusal to apologize. So this is the dimension of shame, where the superior mass and the authority figure blames the smaller one and asks them to carry the shame of inadequacy and be punished with an absence of love and empathy. The dimension of love, number 10. To love someone as an adult, to be loving in its most mature sense, is to behave in a way that facilitates the survival, physical, security of survival, the certainty of physical survival, the love and belonging, the self-esteem, the development of inner gifts, the bringing of those gifts to the community for both value generation and recognition, and ultimately the creation of abundance, and finally transcendence, to go beyond the self. Trauma is the exact opposite of love. Because first of all, it regresses the individual to the reptilian brainstem of fight, flight, or freeze to cope in a sociopathic environment. In the impact of the facilitators on my life around this, as my health collapsed, as I could not earn money, etc., as I felt the shame of the facilitators' inadequacy dumped on me and blamed on me. Peter Sandhill saying he's never going to trust me again for the rest of his life because he fucked up. But he's not going to trust me. This is the transference of shame. In this dynamic, and in a shame cult, the one who carries the shame gets punished, in this case, ostracization, withdrawal of love and belonging. So all of my human needs took a huge dive through both Peter Sandhill's protocol, the facilitator protocol, the board of directors protocol, and the entire community's lack of response to take this seriously. So on the dimension of healthy, mature love, this is the direct opposite, which is also, of course, a violation of the mission, which is all about teaching love. Betrayal. Number 11, the dimension of betrayal. Everyone betrays everyone to varying degrees in this dynamic. I betray myself. I betray the healthy side of the facilitators by allowing them to abuse me, by not knowing the difference between love, which is what they're calling the abuse, and what abuse is. And so the community betrays itself by not protecting one of its own. The board of directors betrays its responsibility to the state to put public interest first in a public nonprofit. The facilitators betray their own loyalty to the healthy parts of themselves and each other. The facilitators betray high and the career. The facilitators betray the community by not informing them of the threats that are present at the level of incompetence held by their therapists and workshop leaders. So there's a tremendous amount of betrayal on that dimension. Number 12, health. My mental, emotional, and physical health took a nosedive. And the real descent, there were several points of descent. One was following Peter's psychic advice to marry a completely inappropriate woman and persisting. I mean, every time I would say, this isn't working, this isn't, why are you seeing this with your great psychic powers, oh Peter? He would say, I don't know why I'm seeing it. This is the most luminous possibility. So it took a huge nosedive as I spent around $60,000 pursuing this completely inappropriate recommendation. And I've never had, of course, a psychic do this. And this goes back to Linda Cesara and her competency in teaching. How is it that someone can graduate and believe they have these psychic powers that have nothing to do with reality? And again, in the superhuman shame dumping, Peter can't make a mistake, you see. So when the marriage and all this is not working and not working and not working, and I tell him, it's all my fault, right? Because Peter has his clear psychic powers. So on the dimension of mental, physical, emotional, and financial health, huge nosedive around that. Another nosedive around the trauma erupting in the car, which you can read the emails and stuff about. Then the biggest nosedive of all came when asking the facilitators to hold me and listen to me, which seemed like the most intelligent thing to do to get all this out of my system. When they all met behind closed doors and excluded me and invited Peter Sandhill to tell his story and back him up, and then tell me it wasn't a high issue. This was the point where trauma became PTSD and the big nosedive occurred. 13, mass. One in a regressed state. So you have a therapeutic client in trauma, now PTSD, in a regressed state. And the law of mass says that when two forces collide, a house and a pinball, a car and a skyscraper, when two forces collide, the superior mass always absorbs and consumes the energy of the smaller mass. Now, this is true psychically, it's true psychologically, it's true physically. You have an army with 5 million people and you have 200 people there and they gallop into one another. It is always the case that the smaller mass gets trampled. And the law of mass in this thing, first of all, when you're in a regressed state, everything is 5 times bigger that's against you. For the child, they're dealing with giants. When you're in a regressed state, it's a state of terror because the world becomes too big for the little infant to deal with. And in a regressed state, I was being told by 4 of my therapists, all held on a pedestal, all of my facilitators, the gatekeepers of my community, and the only people I knew to lean on, I was being told to go in the exact wrong direction that was essential for my well-being and recovery. And those collisions between a large mass and a small mass never end in a good place for a single lone individual. And this is this is also, of course, abuse of power, but this is the dimension of mass, when large mass is used to abuse the smaller mass rather than advocate for their interest. 14, the level of intelligence. Now, intelligence is expressed by the efficiency with which energy is utilized, time, money, and natural resources, to create well-being. Now, one of the more humorous aspects of this whole dynamic is how many hours the facilitators met behind closed doors to figure out how to shut this down, make it secrecy, all compounding their abuse, because secrecy is a primary element in shame and deterioration. Integration involves transparency. And so the facilitators spent an enormous amount of energy making things worse for themselves and everyone else. And so you have a very low level of intelligence. Now, 15, competency. Competency is reflected by the correlation between stated income or stated intention and actual impact. Now, I communicated to complete silence, to my astonishment, that I was in 500% more pain than I had ever felt in my entire life as a result of being excluded, not believed, not advocated for, when I went to the people who in all 30 of my workshops had said, we are committed to healing ignorance and fear. We're committed to a world where everyone wins. We're committed to dignity and love. This whole crowd said, this isn't our issue. We're committed to the whole world winning, but we're not committed to our own client suffering trauma from sexual abuse. We're not committed to you winning. And this led directly to this state, which I communicated to utter silence. This is a profound state of diminishment. And so we have, again, the dimension of competency. Because the facilitators are doing this, they say, because they love me, because this is good for Hai and good for me. The gap is so huge between stated intention and actual impact as to suggest that there is almost zero competency in these facilitators in this terrain. Now, in a regressed state of dependency, this is a terrifying thing. This is one of the reasons children blame themselves, is because it is so scary to realize as a 5-year-old abused child that your parents are full of shit, that they're going to remain full of shit, and that you're stuck with them in a country that is going to leave you alone with them, regardless of their competency. This is such a terrifying thought that children quickly rewrite this reality to it's all my fault. And if I can just figure out how to be good enough, then my superhuman loving parents who don't make any mistakes will finally be able to love me, because then I'll be good enough. So the child reroutes all the terror of grasping with the reality of their parents' incompetence to trying to be good enough for the superhuman parent who doesn't make mistakes. 6, psychedelic abuse. It's hard to have it go much worse than, on the one hand, having an incompetent sitter push you to overdose, meaning Peter begins by pushing me to take 3 times more for my first psychedelic session than I'm feeling safe with. So there's the pushing to go far to the right beyond boundaries. And then pushing for unhealthy direction when these high doses of psychedelics create extreme suggestibility. So having first pushed into an overdose, Peter is then pushing in an unhealthy direction to fight the healthy voice within me and enable the coping mechanisms, the adaptive personality, by embodying extreme denial of his own shadow and his own impact in a variety of ways. And I've touched on that in other areas. And finally, failure to contain or integrate, failure to show up on time for the first integration session or communicate about that. and failure to answer questions needed for a healthy container around emotional attachment that was inappropriately escalated during the session. 17, the dimension of integrity, sanity, and coherence. And so this has everything to do with the behavior that's going on within the Human Awareness Institute lining up with their roles. So the board is supposed to be protecting public interest, not covering up sexual abuse by the facilitators, but they're not doing that. No board member ever asked to interview me. Can you imagine that? I mean, you have chairmen of Ivy League universities being fired because they didn't look into gym teachers that did this and this and the other. But a school about love and intimacy and sexuality, in fact, covers up sexual abuse more than a school that has nothing to do with sexuality. So you have this incredible discrepancy in integrity and roles. The 18th dimension is the dimension of narcissism. Peter, the facilitators, the board, and team all put agendas of their own ahead of the client. And this is expressed by a remarkable fact that in hundreds of emails and conversations, not a single person at High said, "I'm sorry, we fucked up. How can I help you to get back on your feet? What do you need to have this turn around and go well for you?" No one asked the most basic question of attunement of the person who every person in the room, every person in the circle is ethically bound to be primarily interested in the health and safety of a client, let alone a client that's been sexually, spiritually, psychologically abused by an untrained, unlicensed facilitator. I mean, it's the level of narcissism to not ask that question is staggering, and of course repeats the early childhood dynamic. 19, the fractal pattern of national cultural abuse patterns. So within this dimension of the holographic nature of reality, the family embodies and represents the culture, and the individual houses the personas of the entire culture within their personality. So you have this kind of spiral where you have the individual at the smallest level, then you have the family system, you have the culture and the country. And so they all default to the same pattern. And the problem with a school about love and intimacy and sexuality, etc., defaulting to the US national pattern is that the United States is a terrorist. The United States is a master at, with the left hand, undermining democracy, women's liberation, causing terror around the world, and with the right hand, righteously preaching democracy and all that. Now, you cannot default to that pattern, which is what you do until you examine your cult system. You can't default to that as a family without doing the same thing. So, when has the President of the United States apologized for making any number of mistakes? Almost never. So when have my parents apologized for gross misparenting and abuse and all that? Almost never. When have the High facilitators apologized for gross criminal negligence and all forms of psychological abuse? They refuse. This is a fractal pattern that is echoed at bigger and smaller scales. To be a leader in a school, what you're trying to heal is the cult pattern. If the cult wasn't sick, you don't need a school to overcome the pattern. While this is going on with the High facilitators covering up sexual abuse, etc., and blaming the victim. Of course, there is a war on terror that consists of terrifying people by bombing weddings with drones, by killing Reuters newscasters from gunned helicopters because their camera might have been a bomb, and covering it up. You have a tremendous amount of global terrorism by the US military training high school kids to operate these drones as if they're video games, inflicting terror while claiming to be fighting terror. You cannot fight an emotion. You cause an emotion like terror by dropping bombs on innocent people, by causing PTSD to innocent Iraqi civilians, by making up delusions of weapons of mass destruction so that you can blame and project your shadow on another culture. That's the American template. And who are, of course, the biggest enemies? Well, in Richard Nixon's time, Timothy Leary was the most dangerous man in America. Then Martin Luther King was the most dangerous man in America. Now Julian Assange and Edward Snowden are the people for whom laws are suspended arbitrarily. Diplomats grounded in European terrain because Edward Snowden, a truth teller, might be on the plane. So diplomatic immunity be damned. We are going to get to this guy. Who has to flee to Russia for his life and be attacked by his own government? The one individual who honors the Constitution ahead of his career, who doesn't toe the party line. Biden and Obama were on Snowden as the number one threat to the country because he told the truth. This is the fractal pattern that defaults down to corrupt power structures at all levels. Who is the number one enemy to the high facilitators in their mind? A sexually abused client who tells the truth to the community. That's the person who has to be excluded, cut off email addresses, denied an apology, covered up, sued to take down their web. That's the person. Because they're not examining the abuse pattern that they have been given as a power structure in a chauvinistic abuse cult. The high facilitators are an exact embodiment of George Bush in Iraq, of Obama and Snowden, of Trump first praising Assange for digging up dirt on Hillary, and then changing laws and lobbying Britain unconstitutionally to relabel Julian Assange for having the audacity to have never made a mistake in journalism as he reported some of the war crimes. Who's paying the price for revealing the barbaric atrocities of Abu Ghraib? Chelsea Manning is the one getting death threats and attacked by their government. The people, the very people we need to break the taboo cult are the ones having our tax money and military targeted on them with the mass of a country gunning for the silence and death, if necessary, of an individual. This is an outrage, and it is an outrage that is lived by the high facilitators on a community level as they target the sexual abuse survivor they induced into PTSD. For the only time I've ever been sued in my life for doing their job of fulfilling the high mission statement to transform ignorance and fear into a world where more people win with accurate data. So you can see the corruption of power at all levels And on this fractal nature, the high facilitators are right on cue. And if you don't think this is personal, if you don't think it's a message to anyone who would dare, why do you think that the one high intern who gave me support did so on condition that I not reveal their name to the facilitators? Does that sound like a safe, nurturing room of love? The one person who did the right thing is afraid of being punished? How do you think friends of Edward Snowden feel if they're caught helping the one who outed the violations of human rights, the violation of the Constitution? Edward Snowden swore an oath to the Constitution. He didn't swear an oath to criminally follow the orders of corrupt leaders. And so it's valuable to understand that this is being lived out at high, and to reflect on the fact that why exactly would it change in Washington if every single person at high is colluding to replicate an abuse cult at a community level? Why would it somehow change just because it's at a national level? It doesn't. It doesn't change until we face our own shadow. The fact that some part in each one of us wants to kill off the truth for threatening us with the chaos of the unknown and with our fears. Number 20, defense versus responsibility. So the high facilitators, having told me that this was not a high issue, have not spent a penny. High has not spent a penny supporting me because this is not a high issue. They have spent a penny, however, hiring a European court to try and seize a domain. TheHumanAwarenessInstitute.org is a domain that, in the high level of incompetence of the facilitator body, they did not purchase for $8.99 any time in the last 20 years. Now, a competent business, of course, buys their domain. Anyone who, if you understand the domain world, anyone can buy a domain. And it's a very common business, by the way, to buy domains that you think might be valuable and then sell them to people who want to buy them. Someone just contacted me and wanted to buy one of my domains. That's the title of one of my books, and I didn't want to sell it, but that's very, very common. There's no law broken in buying a domain like IBM.com. You can do it, anyone. If IBM is dumb enough not to buy their own domain, that becomes a business. So the high facilitators were not interested in buying their own domain. Who knows why, but they didn't. When it became clear that they would sell out the community and refuse to go public with a deep pattern of abuse that is not personal, I bought the domain for $8 to tell the truth to people who would be searching for high, to do the job the board of directors were hired or were appointed to do, public interest, and were not doing. And having decided it wasn't a high issue to give me support or deal with the issue, High decided it was a high issue for the Human Awareness Institute to silence this website. So first they offered me $8.99 through an attorney to give them the website so that when people search for High, they wouldn't know the story of the abuse. And I, of course, said that was the whole point of buying the website, because if you're not going to protect the public with the truth, I am. They then sued to try and claim they spent public tax-free money to sue a sexual abuse survivor into silence. This is leading the way into the Me Too movement? This is the organization that's going to take you into love and intimacy, into Me You See, the ones that silence sexual abuse from their own facilitators? It's incredible, and it is a profound area of abuse. So no apology, not a high issue, failure to offer help, pressuring the victim to silence, denying, resisting, and lying at times. Peter Sandhill told several lies about things. He said he never did this. No, Peter Sandhill is on a 10-hour recording doing everything I explained that he does. I have that recording. The facilitators have that recording. That doesn't stop Peter. If he thinks he can get away with it. He didn't get away with it because I played it to Anne. I said, here he is saying this. But why should a sexual abuse victim have to prove to the woman who trained, hired, and recommend Peter without a therapeutic license to do work more sensitive than traditional therapy, that the client is telling the truth? 21. I came to a deep understanding of evil in this process. Something felt so dark, so sick, so ugly. It seemed like evil is about the right name for it. And, there's a nice, I think it's an anagram, you have live and you have evil. So you have kind of growth and evolution going forward. And then you have some of the most destructive patterns that regress, that take you back. And what struck me as most evil is when the best sides of someone are used as leverage to inflict harm on them. And so you have a pattern where I take time off work because I want to grow. I pay money because I'm willing to pay money to grow. I drive to Peter Sandhill's house, a 2-hour round trip, so that I can grow. I trust my therapist, heaven forbid, so that I can learn. And within 5 minutes of arriving at Peter's house, more than 14, 15 years ago, something like that, I'm confronted as a homosexual virgin with Peter's erection, and am then told, he's interested in a male lover, he wants an open relationship, he's going into his marital dynamics on the clock, violating his high principles. So I'm doing all of this good stuff. We want a world where people care enough to go seek help with a professional when they understand that they don't know what they're doing in this complicated terrain of relationships. For that trust and innocence to be twisted, to take the person into traumatic terrain, is the worst possible scenario. It is evil. If I hadn't had innocence and trust and desire and enthusiasm and money and time, I wouldn't have been hurt as badly as I would. I have been hurt because of what was good in me, because of what was true in me, because of what was beautiful. And that is about as evil as it gets, when what is good is turned against. You give someone some money out of kindness and they use the money to hire a hitman on you. That's evil, because it discourages trust, transcendence, growth, humility. It is evil, as best as I can come up with a definition for the word. 22, data. The dimension of data is a very important one, because the scientific paradigm, which is the prevailing paradigm of our age, says that the way you make intelligent action is you try an experiment and you learn what statistically correlates. So if you want to make money, for example, 80% of people who invest money in houses make money if you invest in real estate. By contrast, 80% of people who trade commodities futures lose money. Now, the purpose of the scientific method is that's useful data. If you know that, you can avoid a scam course trying to sell you into how easy it is to make money in commodities futures. You can avoid some of the get-rich-quick schemes if you actually have data on how many people lose money with them. If you have actual data at pharmaceutical companies about the number of people who get permanently psychotic because of this antidepressive and this and that, you can make informed decisions. So this is the metric of data, and it references this scientific principle. For data to work, you've got to gather statistical data. And I have never been asked once by the Human Awareness Institute to share the pattern of data that has been accumulated in 100 high events, in 4 facilitators. The data isn't gathered. When I share the data, it is ignored more often than not. And when I share data, it is not shared with the community. And so there is a forced and willful ignorance. You see, Ann Watts recommended me to Peter 14 years ago. He abused me, so I stopped working with him. I stopped paying for the abuse. I came to Ann. She never asked, I recommended you to Peter. What went on there? Well, first he told me he had an erection because of me. Then he told me he wanted me to pay him $600 to take MDMA with him. Then he told me about his open marriage, and the whole thing just felt terrible. And so I'm not going to pay money to feel terrible. Oh, I'm sorry, I recommended an incompetent person. I trained him. And so there can be a response only if data is gathered. You cannot build human awareness while suppressing and ignoring data. And there is a tremendous amount of data that is just waiting for one competent individual to send out a few emails to the entire community and gather statistical data. How many rapes in the last year within the high community? How many people pushed through no's? How many people found themselves in an abuse contract where they said yes, but deep inside they meant no, and they were, in effect, raped because they were regressed children who hadn't dealt with their abuse contracts? How many? We don't know, because the Human Awareness Institute doesn't want the data, so they don't ask. And they push back when someone wants to tell them. 23, best organizational practices. A good organization, the board of directors is designed to oversee and protect the mission from corruption by the employees, etc. So we have what's called a paper board, a board that was chosen largely for its incompetence and loyalty to the facilitators who don't know their job and will not put the public first. Not a good organizational practice there. We have unlicensed therapists going beyond the terrain of traditional therapy with touch and with an open-ended, non-caveat promise. We want to help, we're good at it, let us help you and pay us money. We have sacrificing public good for personal survival within every one of the facilitators, or you would have heard all of this from them. They know it, but they're not telling you why. 24, the dimension of catch-22s. It was one of the most frustrating because it was an area I felt lonely and invisible. First of all, the people who need the most therapy are people who have been abused at home. So if your therapist abuses you, you can't go to the therapist for one, when Peter abused me, he refused to take money out of the relationship. So Peter wanted me to pay him $175 an hour. You can think of the indignity. To ask him for an apology so that he could explain at $175 an hour why he had nothing to apologize for. So, you can't, if your therapists abuse you, you can't fall back on your abusive family, and you can't fall back on your therapist, and you can't fall back on your abuse cult where no one wants to deal with it. So you've got a catch-22 if your therapists abuse you. Desperately needing help reaching out for the high facilitators. What the high facilitators wanted was secrecy. So secrecy is bad for shame, which was a core issue, and it's bad for trauma because you don't get support and integration in the community and your help is isolated. So your abuser wants to isolate you. So when you need help and your abuser is more interested in your isolation than in you getting the support, it's another catch-22. And when you want to help the community, but you're fought, another catch-22. So there were any number of these catch-22s around this dynamic. 25, abuse of power. If you've read the email lists, or when I was a member of NorCal Announce, it had some guidelines, and nowhere in the guidelines, of course, did it mention that you would be terminated from the list for revealing that a facilitator sexually abused you. When I went online one day to ask for Cuddle Buddy to help me, because I was so nervous and anxious from this whole dynamic, my email didn't work. And then I went on to Heartbeat, and my password didn't work. And I thought, this is fascinating. In the more than 10 years that I've been writing hundreds of posts, I've never been blocked as you don't have access to this list, never once. And now suddenly, together, right after I've announced to the facilitators that I'm going to tell the community what's going on. Now, the high facilitators didn't have the guts or the compassion or the ethics to either support my truth or to explain to me that they would be cutting off my membership. They left me to feel the rug pulled out from under me. So that the message is, our secret is so much more important than you getting support for the trauma we've caused you, that we have a secret clause in the email address that says, if you are revealing facilitator negligence, we may, at our own discretion, unilaterally and without notice, cut you out of the community. And this is the threat of an abusive power structure over an individual. The power structure in this case is a gatekeeper for the third human need, love and belonging, which helps to reassure survival and security. They're cutting it out to protect the secret. I wasn't referred to a trauma therapist. And Ann Watts expressed a continual conflict of interest beginning with her advising me to keep it secret for my benefit, which is a lie. 26, the dimension of attachment theory. So within attachment theory, based on your family structure, you either have secure relationships with both parents, or you have insecure relationships with one parent and secure with the other, or you have insecure relationships with both parents. And the problem with an insecure relationship with both parents is you feel completely unsupported, particularly in an abuse dynamic. And it makes it very difficult to learn emotional regulation. So someone, like in a family system where you can't tell the truth and you can't have deep feelings, which is another form of truth, doesn't get to learn regulation skills because the very act of bonding in such a family is a threat to the family secrets. And so the child is attacked while attempting to form a secure attachment with either parent. The result of this is incredible insecurity and volatility, and it's called insecure attachment disorder. Now, having had two such traumatized and traumatizing parents, I didn't have a secure attachment with either parent. This has left it very difficult for me to find mid-ground. I can either cling or I can have nothing to do with someone, but it's very difficult to reestablish such a template when in the normal maturation process that forms in the 0 to 5 year range. That didn't happen. Now, we are in a culture that shames neediness, and I am very aware that my form of attachment is perceived as needy by a majority of Americans, which means it's very unsafe to form any relationship for me, because as soon as I form one, I've got to hold on tighter than most people in our culture are comfortable with. And I am thrown to the curb in shame, in humiliation, and with zero sensitivity or awareness, because we are a psychologically illiterate cult, because we don't bother to teach high school or college students the most basic aspects of relational literacy, and because our therapists are not terribly well trained. How is it that I could demonstrate clear symptoms of insecure attachment and not one of the 4 facilitators pointed it out? How is it that this is not part of the high curriculum to understand attachment theory, since it affects so many people? Nevertheless, in a traumatic state, re-traumatized, you must have help when dealing with trauma. You must. All of the literature supports this, because you're flooded. The events are so big, you can't see. You've lost all perspective, so you don't feel safe. Things go out of focus. You're stuck in a blur. That's trauma and PTSD, and you need help to come back into focus. You need support. It is essential. I desperately needed help, and I clung to the facilitators and was excluded and pushed out and denied. This dynamic of traumatizing someone with insecure attachment disorder, not helping them understand it, not attuning to them, and refusing to give the support by simply asking, "What do you need?" which is on the tip of my tongue anytime someone asks. I've gotten very good at knowing what I need, because there's such a strength with both the insecure attachment plus being highly sensitive. Another thing that we are culturally illiterate about. 27, spiritual abuse. My highest truths and my feminine persona, as well as the first time I fell in love with a man, happened on high doses of psilocybin combined with high doses of MDMA. This is a recipe, by the way, for a heterosexual virgin or a homosexual virgin to fall in love with a man, or whoever's there. The psilocybin opens up the 3rd chakra, and the MDMA opens up the heart chakra without protection, without a sense of negative judgment or critical thought. So naturally, I fall in love with the person who's there. That's Peter Sandhill. He's pushed for a high dose against my wishes. That occurs. Now we're in the dynamic of insecure attachment, which he hasn't bothered to find out, of course. But it opens up a deep sense of authentic self, and I begin speaking truth that has been too frightening to speak, so it's been blocked from consciousness. And Peter begins fighting that truth, dishonoring the feminine that is being born. In that relationship, in that homosexual relationship, I am in the feminine position as a client, as the younger person, as the more sensitive. And Peter is in the masculine position, but he is in engaging in his masculine role as violator rather than as protector of the feminine. This is spiritual abuse. When a rebirth is happening and your healer attacks what is good in you to protect his blind spots, his lies, his needs to see reality in a way in which he makes no mistakes. 28. The illiteracy of the grieving process. We are in a completely incompetent culture when it comes to grieving. Thank heavens Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has written a few books of them, except almost no Americans read them, and certainly not people when they are, children when they're losing people, etc. The first major grief came when I lost the one woman who I was able to bond securely with, my third grade Waldorf teacher. She died in a car accident like that. I went numb. No one around me knew what dissociation was. So they stigmatized me rather than understanding their lack of competency around trauma and the grief process. I didn't learn to grieve. No one modeled it for me. Everyone was blank. As my truths were dishonored, as my femininity was ground down to satisfy the narcissistic needs of my therapist with my first male lover, I didn't know how to process that grief. And so being pushed into severe grief while being grief illiterate by a healer is profound psychic and spiritual abuse. Number 29, the lack of ethics in the surrounding therapeutic community. There were 3 therapists I told about the high abuse dynamic. And I was trying to figure out why I was so upset as they told me to just walk away and move on. And then it dawned on me. The professionals are protecting the other therapists at the expense of the public. Not one of my therapists showed a single ounce of interest in all of the high community and team members who, if you understand that this is not personal, that this could happen to anyone in the community at the current level of facilitator training, is a public safety threat. And they were taking money to advise me to do nothing about a major public safety threat. Now, that would have been fine if they had said, we'll take care of this. What's their license number? We'll report this to the state. You're in trauma and grief. This is not your burden. It's our burden to regulate our own industry. We're therapists, we're healers. We care about the public. Not a single one did. And I didn't feel safe with these individuals because they would have done the same to me. How many high participants, sexually abused by high facilitators, had these therapists run into and told them to leave me vulnerable to abuse by telling them not to tell anyone. Exactly what Ian Watts had counseled me, to the expense of the entire high community. I felt deeply disturbed by the level of collusion within the therapeutic community, and it left me feeling isolated and unsafe because I'm not willing to walk away. Now, I don't understand my notes here on number 30, so I'll go on to number 31. Number 31, ignorance of forgiveness. There were one or two people in the high community when I wrote to the whole team and all of the people in my workshops who actually responded. And one of them said, you just have to forgive everyone involved and move on. And of course, this doesn't work when you're in trauma, when you're in PTSD, when you've got grief that hasn't processed because you don't know how to go through the stages, when you've got a spiritual critic saying anger is bad. This doesn't work. There is an entire process that one has to go through that includes mastering and becoming conscious of the dynamic and securing one's safety from reenacting before forgiveness becomes relevant or healthy, before it becomes possible. You cannot forgive from the reptilian brainstem. It is a sociopathic brainstem. Fight, flight, freeze doesn't have anything to do with forgiveness. So anyone that tells someone in trauma to forgive is simply shouting out, I'm trauma literate, but I don't want to deal with that. So I'm going to make you feel bad that you can't just do what cannot be done. And so there's a tremendous amount of ignorance around forgiveness that ends up causing shame and frustration because it took years to begin the forgiveness process, because it takes years to learn the psychological literature that a therapist is supposed to teach you but didn't, to a point where I can feel relatively confident I'm not going to let this happen again to myself or those I love. Now I can let go of the energy. It served its purpose, which is to bring things to consciousness and to awareness. Number 33. Public safety. When the board, the government, the parent, the therapist, and the team fail to put public safety first, the feeling of pressure falls on the abuse survivor, because I know it's not personal, because I watched it happen over a 10-year period. This feeling of it's up to me to protect others, but I can't take care of myself, is an incredible burden and an abuse that should not be placed on a therapeutic client. 34. Leaving me small so power figures can feel big. it's now 14, 15 years ago, when I left Peter Sandhill after feeling terrible and saying basically to Peter, I don't know what's going on here, and I didn't, but I'm not going to pay you to feel terrible, and I only feel terrible with you. Peter said he understood, he was very magnanimous, and he loved me. And anytime I worked out my problems, I could come back and he would support me. In other words, he didn't acknowledge that suggesting taking MDMA with him for $600, an illegal drug for someone who'd never taken drugs or been drunk, was anything to be concerned about. The idea of telling a heterosexual male that he'd like to have a homosexual relationship in an open marriage, when childhood trauma and all that had not even been dealt with, didn't occur to him. This was all love, according to an untrained therapist. And what he continually did was transfer his ignorance and inadequacy into my symptoms of dissociation and fear, and then challenge me to be bigger than my fear so I could let in his love. I had to pay him to ask him for an apology, which he wouldn't give because he didn't do anything wrong. As part of the shame dynamic, there is a need to feel big by the abuser, which requires the abuse survivor to feel small in order to have a relationship within that dynamic. With a broken heart, with severely damaged trust, feeling ashamed, feeling valueless, right after promising to take this superhuman stand, he couldn't even show up for my appointment on time. I am made to feel completely invisible, lonely, and worthless by the person I have hired to transcend that pattern with my family. And it's all my fault, and I should pay for it, which just amplifies the abuse 1,000-fold. There is a continual pattern within the entire high organization of denial, minimization, shaming, deflection, silence, and a complete disinterest in the well-being of the person who should be the largest person in their focus. If you're not willing to make your therapeutic client the most important part in your life while you're doing that work, you don't deserve to do the work. To instead make them feel like utter shit so that you can avoid acknowledging your mistakes is part of a continual pattern of we need to feel big, so you need to be small so that we can meet our agenda. And it goes beyond that because we want you to be so small. We want you to go through the worst crisis of your life. And then we are not going to apologize, but we want you to relabel that abuse as love to be grateful for, so that we can feel superior and competent and not face our shame. That's the dimension of transferring size, which, ironically, in trauma, you feel incredibly small because you're overwhelmed. You need to feel big and powerful to help believe that you can overcome your fear of death, which is what is facing you on various levels. Being asked to be tiny at that moment, held in suspense as the facilitators have closed-door meetings to decide things they're not going to include you in. The degree of smallness they demanded at a time when I desperately needed to feel big is staggeringly ignorant of the traumatic dimension. 35, faulty psychic advice. I already touched on that, but Peter just announced that it would be the most luminous possibility in my life to marry a person who, one, I only knew for a week, and two, who had zero logistical basis for such a compatibility. I needed someone with lots of quality time. She had none. I needed someone who was compatible with my style of having sex before marriage. she needed to be married before having sex. I don't like paying someone to be in a relationship. She's the only person in my life who asked me to pay a dowry to her father for $30,000 to marry her. So first, I should marry her. Then I should marry her before having sex. Then I should pay her father $30,000 to marry her so that I could fulfill Peter's psychic vision that this was this luminous possibility. Well, this just went downhill from there. And every time I talked to Peter, he just pressed continually that he was right. And I just had to work through these insurmountable odds to fulfill my greatest destiny. Now, if you understand that I'm in a regressed place, in love, disintegrated, confused, and needing help from my therapist, and his only advice is, let's not talk about our relationship, go marry this woman. It's incredibly potent suggestion. And that advice cost me 60% of my health during that time because I kept getting traumatized by this woman. I had to literally throw her out of my room, the only time I've ever had to do that. There's just one thing after another. And I would call my therapist saying, you sure you would want this? Isn't there anything else that, no, this is your luminous vision, let me see, let me look in my psychic power. You need to talk to 2 of her relatives. Peter, none of them speak English, and they don't like me because I'm not a traditional Thai person, and they don't like me. Well, all I can see, you've got to talk to, well, can you find me an interpreter, Peter? I can't. That's the best I can do for now, but I'm glad I can help. Here's my bill, and you can call for more advice later. This was my one tether, and it's a joke in retrospect. But in a regressed place, when you're in love and this, this is completely predictable for this type of situation, particularly when I had 0 person to hold on to, and I'm looking for that because I need help because I'm in trauma. Number 36, the dimension of business. Jason Weston told me that High's a business and has got to make money and all this. It's just worth mentioning. It's obviously not my business. But every single one of these abuses is terrible for business because High is in the business of fulfilling its mission as a public service in a public nonprofit. To do the opposite of all this, of course, destroys your business. There's absolutely no legitimate way to recommend a business that's doing the opposite of its mission and committed to doing so and covering it up. 37, pattern of denial. So this pattern of denial, at first I thought it was just Peter. But as all the facilitators lined up to play Peter's game of, no, first it wasn't Peter's issue. It wasn't Peter's issue at all, right? Well, then when I brought it to the facilitators, they blamed it on Peter, so it was Peter's issue. But now it wasn't their issue, right? And when I had gone through this 10 years earlier with Peter, he'd of course told Sarah. Sarah showed fear in her eyes for about 5 years after Peter expressed sexual interest in me. And Peter told me she did not like what was happening in our session. Sarah was afraid of me, though. She wasn't afraid of her husband's incompetence. This is alienating. Peter's behavior is weakening his client's relationship with his wife and fellow therapist because I'd done a session with Sarah. There's a pattern of denial, and there's a pattern of fearfully hiding what needs to be discussed with the client so that the client can be sane and help differentiate abuse and love, which is critical for a client winning, which is High's whole mission statement. 38. Cultural ignorance in most of these dimensions. Sociopathic cultural responses to most of these human states. Meaning part of the abuse of behaving like this in a public nonprofit and in a therapy environment is you now lose your nonprofit, you lose your community, you lose your therapist. So where do you turn to? You have an abusive family, so you don't turn there. So you have to turn to the cult around you. Our culture is so willfully ignorant, committed to not, let's learn algebra, let's learn trigonometry, let's learn anything but the basic coherence that a human being would see to need to relate with themselves and have healthy relationships with other human beings. The result of that in a shame-based culture is that if I bring any of this terrain to my neighbor or this, or I brought some of it to my landlord, all he said was, I'd sue the bastards. That's all he'd say. He has no idea what I'm talking about. How many of you would look at what happened with Peter and list these dimensions? Do you know how many books I had to read to figure out what was going on at all these different levels? Books that are not recommended at High. High does not want you to read all these books and understand their abuse dynamic. You've got to go out on your own and piece these things together, because we are shamefully and willfully ignorant in our culture. The result being that I am completely alone as I'm experiencing these things and blaming myself because no one knows how to help me. And I don't know how to help myself. This is the tyranny of, it's like being given a disease in a country that doesn't have doctors capable of fixing it. You're just screwed. 39. Trauma needs help. The only help I'm given is help conditional on secrecy. The secrecy deepens the trauma and denies integration and support. So it's not help. So it's one of those catch-22s. 40. The last thing I wanted to be was in an adversarial relationship with the people I was desperately clinging to for help. However, by being pushed by all of the facilitators, meaning Jason Weston gave me an abuse contract to sign, and most children don't get to read their abuse contracts. And so this was rather nice because it is absolute classic abuse contract. Any 6-year-old could have signed this, but they'd never get a copy. And the contract that Jason Weston sent me to sign via email was, I promise never to tell anyone what happened and never to sue High. Oh, and by the way, this isn't a High issue. And please sign your name here. It doesn't get nicer than that as a clear abuse contract. You're not as important as we are. Please become invisible in an organization that promotes into me you see. We would like you to understand that that only applies to things that make us look good. It doesn't apply to areas we've hurt you. And so just, let your wife never know who you are because you've promised your abuser not to tell the truth so that you can't integrate. Now, the healthiest parts in me needed integration and the truth for sanity, for well-being, for support. which when your teachers and facilitators fear the truth, creates this illusion of enemy. I knew they were all terrified of the truth coming out, which was incredibly disconcerting for your teachers and therapists, because it means that they don't know what they're doing, which means that you're screwed because you're depending on them to help get out of this trauma. I didn't want to be an enemy, but by being healthy, I have become a perceived enemy. And this is incredibly sad and incredibly lonely, just like Edward Snowden went through when he had to flee to Russia. You see, the United States canceled Edward Snowden's passport when he had received diplomatic immunity in Ecuador. Ecuador said, here's a guy protecting the world from American bullying, protecting the American people from violations of the Constitution at the highest levels of government. And he's followed his Constitution and needs political asylum from the tyranny of the shame-based abuse cult that is the military U.S. government. So they granted Edward Snowden diplomatic immunity. Now, what Joe Biden did as he was calling around the different countries to make sure that Edward Snowden couldn't get any safe passage anywhere was he canceled Edward Snowden's passport. You can see the fractal pattern, canceling email access. Canceled the passport while in mid-flight, once it was learned that he was going to Russia, and then from Russia he would fly on to Ecuador. Now, the trouble with a canceled passport was the Russians said, we can't pass you through because you have a canceled passport. And so Edward Snowden was forced to settle in Russia. And you have the same fractal pattern, because by refusing to deal with any of these patterns in public and directly, the high facilitators force someone who's never been in court except when they sued him towards legal proceedings, which I have zero interest. What requires legal proceedings is a public nonprofit who will do the exact opposite of its mission and tyrannize its victim and turn them into the enemy to protect a secret that the public has a right to know, to be at choice. That's about the only type of situation where it's like, screw the money, something has to be done about this. So you think of the delusion, it's like, so America is afraid of Edward Snowden because he speaks the truth. And I've followed this story deeply because I understood it correlated to my own at a step-down version, nothing like at that level. But I understood that the same thinking was running the high facilitators, because that's the default in American power structures that are shame-based. It was the thinking in my family. It's the thinking of Peter Sandhill. This is the default defense. And what's so ironic is you'd think if Edward was really such a security threat that the last place you'd want him to be is Russia, except that shame-based, fear-based system isn't rational. Of course the last place you want him to be is Russia. But they have necessitated Russia by canceling his passport exactly as he was touching down in Moscow. And then they've tried to blame that on him. Like he's with a foreign agent, He was going to Ecuador. And Assange was going to Ecuador as well. They just came up with a variety of trumped-up charges, etc., to keep him locked in the embassy for 7 years, and have broken down the embassy. The U.S. bribed Ecuador to revoke the immunity for some military, deep back deals and stuff like that. This is the level of evil we're dealing with as a power structure. Julian Assange tells the truth that the US government doesn't like dealing with. Let's kill him. That's the attitude. That's the mentality. A high client and participant tells the truth and dirt that threatens the sanctimonious image of the high facilitators. Let's sue him. Let's cut him off of the community. Let's do whatever we can. If we could just shut this down. And who cares if he dies along the way? Who cares if he dies? There's been no question about that, no how you're doing, none of that. Because that's secondary to short-term ego survival in these abuse patterns. Number 41, psychological blindness made self-care harder. Now, having gone through 100 high events and worked with 4 facilitators, I can say that there are 0 definitions for addiction, 0 definitions for love, 0 definitions for trauma, 0 definitions for abuse other than doing something when they say no. If someone says no and you do it, that's considered abuse. But it doesn't deal with the fact that when you've signed an abuse contract, you may say yes when you mean no. I would say that in probably 20 to 30% of the lover interactions within the high community, someone would say something that wasn't good for them out, and it was very clear they were in a regressed, fearful state in retrospect, but I didn't have the language to see it. People say yes when they mean no all the time, because that's what abuse contracts are. That's how they affect people, and our culture doesn't deal with them, so people don't break their abuse contracts. They just live them out with different partners. That blindness, when abused by the facilitators, left me blind as to exactly how I was being abused. I knew I was in more pain than I'd ever felt, but I didn't know why, so I couldn't articulate it. So this is a form of abuse, to teach loving relationships, but not teach the language necessary to know how to take care of oneself or another person. Number 42, push to relive the trauma to create sanity. Meaning when you've got all of your mentors, all of your community leaders, all of your therapists all ganging up and living a lie, pretending like nothing wrong is going on, because we're not going to apologize. This never happened. If it did, it wasn't our fault. And then if it was, it wasn't a high issue. It was Peter's issue. And if it was Peter's issue, he doesn't have to do a refund or anything because it was all done in good fun, right? So when you have so many people ganging up in a denial pattern, it's very easy to feel crazy, particularly when you're dissociative and traumatized. And so you have to go through it again and again, like, am I crazy? This happened, this happened. And so there is a pressure to go insane that is counteracted with a pressure to say, no, this did happen. I have the tape. It's still there. This relives the trauma. And it is a dimension of abuse that when your abuser will not come clean, what they are asking you to do is go insane, which is asking you to relive the event so that you prove you're sane. Yes, I'm not just feeling sick and tired and depressed for no reason. This did actually happen, but every time it's relived, it's painful. And it can't easily be put to rest because of the burden of understanding that this same spring-loaded pattern is just waiting to hit the next victim, who happens to fall into the right little crack to have this little pattern reenacted. Number 43, overwhelmed and traumatized with bigness. Lack of embodied validation and a lack of complexity to deal with this. I didn't have the tools mentally, emotionally, or physically to deal with all that was dumped on me at such intense levels so fast by so many people from so many angles. I didn't have the vocabulary. I didn't have the resources. I didn't have the backup help. I didn't have a backup therapist. Apparently, in the United States, in case your therapist sexually abuses you, you have to have 3 or 4 therapists in the wings, so that when the first one, abuses you, you can have a backup. And I didn't have any of that backup. So it just hit me as way too big. And I would say that, in childhood, my parents lied a lot and denied a lot. And so the only way I was safe was I had to figure out the whole pattern. And then I would know, when they twitch their eye like that and go like that, they're going to hit me. They're going to say it's love and all that, but the bottom line is I've got to watch for this, and then I've got to get out of there before they hit me. I've got to watch see, when mom and dad are fighting and don't want to take responsibility, they're going to look for one of their children to blame. They're fighting, so I need to be out of the way so that I don't get blamed. And so to figure out the pattern was the only way I knew how to be safe in a sociopathic household. This pattern has been incredibly hard to figure out. But my little boy in there is saying, we've got to figure this out. We're not safe until we can figure this all out. It's very hard when people are hiding. And and of course the dynamic is 100 times bigger. And there's more egos at stake. There's more careers at stake. There's all this stuff. There's a lot more fear in the dynamic. But some part of me can't rest until it's all figured out, which is an incredible burden because it's consumed an enormous amount of life energy to figure it out. And the best I could do, since I can't put that fear to rest, is share it with everyone else so that everyone else doesn't have to go through the same learning curve that I did, just because all my therapists advised me not to tell anyone and move on and leave it for the next victim to stumble into. Number 44, a crisis of trust. You see, on the dimension of trust and confidence comes from success. And in roughly 100 lover relationships, I've developed a fair amount of confidence because I've been relatively successful at predicting what's happening, figuring out the patterns, predicting disengaging from unhealthy partners that wanted to hurt me, or not entering relationships where people are going to trigger that insecure dynamic, or things like that. I trusted the high facilitators, and every single one of them let me down. This destroys confidence. It means my algorithm for trust is incomplete. My algorithm for confidence in my trust is faulty. This is a paralysis. The whole basis of acting is based on trust that what you do will make things better. So many things I did made things worse because I trusted the wrong people. Here's the problem. I trusted the wrong people. You didn't, or you did as well, but there is no logical reason to say that I put most of my eggs in the basket of people who would absolutely throw me under the bus at the worst possible moment and risk my life, just like my parents. And I'm going to go out and pick the next group of people who I'm going to trust? There's no, psychics or spiritual teachers say, oh, you picked your parents for this lesson and all this. So there's no basis of trust in that. If I picked my parents, it was one of the cruelest decisions imaginable. Not trustworthy. And I definitely, and I don't remember that, of course, because they just say this. You picked your parents. I didn't. I don't remember that. Doesn't make sense to me. Not the kind of people I would pick. But I did pick high. And I thought they were different. I thought they were different. So you see the crisis of trust, which ripples out into all life. I didn't see this coming. I have never experienced a therapist behave as irrationally as Peter Sandhill. But he was the one I picked for the most vulnerable transcendent, suggestible moment of my life. And he completely blew it.